Good morning, students. Today we are going to continue the 6 days war. What was the causes of the war? The causes of the war was increasing tensions between Israel and its neighboring Arab states since the formation of the State of Israel in 1948. Israel adopted a policy of diverting water from Jordan River to the Negev desert, and this became the cause of tension. This angered the Arabs so much that they threatened to divert this flow into the Lake Galilee. So, in 1965-66, Israel bombed Zaire, and soon after they began implementing the policy of diverting river. The PLO and Fatah movement started against Israel, and as a result, the already tense situation became extreme. Now, most of these activities were initiated from the West Bank and Golan Heights. So Israel felt that the war was an effective solution of wiping out these movements. In the meantime, what happened? A militant anti-Israel group, Baath Party, came to power in Zaire in 1966. President Nasser also took a militant stance against Israel, and he then asked the UN for peacekeeping force. So what was the result which came at last? This was a great success for Israel, and this time they strongly ignored a UN order to return the captured territories. These territories became buffer zone between Israel and Arab. Next. But this also created a new problem for Israel, as Israel had to deal with about 1 million extra. This was a great humiliation for the Arab states, and more specifically for Nasser. His prestige was lost like anything. Similarly, Yom Kippur War was a part of the Arab-Israel conflict since 1948, when the State of Israel was formed. Israel's victory in the 6 Days War of 1967 gave her control over the territories, 4 times its previous size. Egypt lost her huge land area in Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip. Even Jordan lost the West Bank and eastern Jerusalem. Zaire lost the strategic Golan Heights. The Arab states could not tolerate this condition. PLO under its leader Yasser Arafat now pressed for some further action. When Anwar Sadat became president of Egypt after Nasser in 1970, he found that Egypt was economically a troubled nation. In this situation, Egypt could no longer afford to continue its endless crusades against Israel. He wanted to make peace with Israel to achieve stability and recover Sinai. But he realized that after Israel's victory of 1967, it was likely that the peace terms would not be favorable for Egypt. Sadat now sent back 20,000 Soviet advisors from Egypt and opened new diplomatic channel with America. Sadat decided to attack Israel again with Zaire, hoping that this would force America to act as mediator. So what were the consequences of the war? Israel's victory at the cost of heavy casualties. A lot of people have lost their lives. People severely were attacked. And secondly, although Egypt had again suffered military defeat, the initial Egyptian success greatly enhanced Sadat's prestige. So now for Syria, the Yom Kippur War was a great disaster and unexpected Egyptians. Israel ceasefire exposed Syria to military defeat. Thus, the unexpected Egyptian-Israeli ceasefire exposed Syria, and Arab oil-producing states tried to bring pressure on USA and other Western European states. Similarly came up the Camp David Accord. After the Yom Kippur War, the Egyptian President Sadat became convinced that Israel could not be destroyed by force, and it was a foolish thought to keep on wasting the sources of Egypt in fruitless wars. The Arabs cannot ignore the fact that the formation of Israel is a reality. Like Egypt, Israel also had a number of economic problems due to their enormous defense expenditure. America also pressed Israel to settle their disputes with at least some of the Arab states. The US President Jimmy Carter took the initiatives for a formal negotiation between two countries at a place called Camp David. The state of war between Egypt and Israel since 1948 now came to an end and Israel agreed to vacate Sinai. Thus, Egypt agreed to remove blockade of Suez Canal, and Egypt promised not to attack Israel again and guaranteed to supply Israel oil from recently opened wells in southern Sinai. So Egypt worked on her own without the consent of the Arab League. The Sadat knew very well that Syria and Jordan had no capacity to fight with Israel, and Sudan, Morocco, and Oman supported Egypt from very beginning. Anwar Sadat was strongly condemned for this accord. Thus, similarly, the Israel-PLO Oslo Peace Accord came up in 1993. In this, the Treaty of Camp David was condemned by the Palestine Liberation Organization and most of the Arab states. World opinion went against Israel now, but still America continued to play an active role in promoting peace and permanent settlement in this area. The American attempt to make a peace settlement was threatened when President Anwar Sadat of Egypt was assassinated by some extremist Muslim soldiers. While he was watching a military parade in October 1981, they believed that he had betrayed the Arabs. But Sadat's successor, Hosni Mubarak, declared that he would continue the Camp David Agreement. For most of 1980s, the Arab-Israel feud was overshadowed. The situation changed when a new government came to power in Israel. After the election of June 1992, the new Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was prepared to claim the concessions for a lasting peace on the other side. The PLO leader Yasser Arafat also responded to this call. Now, Oslo Peace Accord of September 1993, the main clauses were like Israel formally recognized the PLO. PLO also recognized Israel and promised to give up terrorism. The Palestinians were to be given the limited self-rule. At last the criticism came up with this accord. This step was welcomed by most of the leaders. A section of PLO wanted to complete independent Palestine state. Israeli settlers in the West Bank were against all the concessions. The moderate leaders, on the other hand, showed great courage and determination. Thus, the new state Israel government denounced the previous policy as too soft towards Palestine, and this threw the whole process of peacemaking into a doubt again now. Again, the same thing came back to. So they were now a situation came up with the Palestinians also entered in the region. But as the new government came again with this statement, it came up with a doubt. So in this we are completing our lesson, the Middle East chapter. Today few materials on Middle East short question answers and few long I am giving you. Long question answers part is left out, short is already given in your previous material. So please do it and solve it. Thank you. And today Middle East is over. To next class we are going to do protest movement revision. Okay. Thank you, students.